In the last World War of the 20th century, a farm boy from the rugged bushland of South Africa took to the bloody skies over Europe during World War II and made history. Embraced as a hero and one of the few by the embattled island of Britain and its king, but considered a traitor by many in his own country. Born in 1910 in Wellington, South Africa, Group Captain Wg Cdr Malan would fight 3 battles in his life. One would end in victory over Germany.
It became known as Sailors' Day. On the 11th of August, at the height of the Battle of Britain, 74 Squadron destroyed 23 enemy aircraft.
Another would end in defeat as he took on South Africa's apartheid government.
One of the reasons they might not have arrested him was that by 1959, he was still very outspoken against apartheid, but it was also clear that he was seriously ill.
The third would end in death as a result of Parkinson's disease.
And I was relieved when he died because he was so helpless and so frustrated with this disease.
Cutting short a full, promising, yet humble life. One of Cdr Malan's 10 rules for air fighting was to always turn and face the attack. For him, this was not only true in a dogfight, it was true whenever injustice or adversity confronted you in life. This 6-episode series paints a compelling picture of the remarkable life of this, in all other respects, unremarkable, ordinary man. Face the Attack, the 3 battles of Cdr Malan, uses the terms and language of the times in which the events took place, which some may find offensive or difficult to hear. Listener discretion is advised. To receive weekly episodes, plus additional content, follow this series wherever you find your favorite podcasts. To discover more, visit facetheattack.com. Episode 3. Fighter.Teacher.Leader. Malan saw action over Dunkirk as the British tried frantically to evacuate men from the beaches. Day in and day out, he would fly combat missions to destroy prowling German aircraft. It was on one of these that he shot down his first enemy plane. At 21,000 feet, in a clear sky, he yelled "Tally-ho" and entered the history books. He closed in and opened fire, his incendiary bullets striking the enemy plane's fuselage. The rear gunner in the enemy aircraft stopped shooting at him, and the plane went down. Malan would also share in the destruction of another enemy plane that day. He seemed like an elegantly skilled bull terrier. With battles raging at 15 to 20,000 feet, he would throw his Spitfire around like a toy and, in many cases, follow his prey down to just a few feet off the ground. Malan's single-minded focus of air combat would spur him on, not to achieve ace status or for the medals, but simply to do the job he was trained to do: shoot down German fighters and bombers. Over Dunkirk and in combat for only 1 week, Malan and 74 Squadron flew constant, tiring and terrifying missions. By the end of Dunkirk, 74 had lost men, but they had shot down 16 German planes in the process. One of his most often quoted recollections tells us how he felt about his first combat experiences. "I tasted blood at last. The release from tension was terrific. The thrill, enormous. I'd been wondering for so long, too long, how I'd react in my first show. Now I knew. Everything I had learned had come right. There was hardly any time to feel scared." John Freeborn also recalled those moments of combat vividly.
"I think that I was extremely frightened on all occasions. But once we got airborne and you know they've got a job to do, then the fear leaves you. The intense feeling of ability comes to you. The adrenaline is flying and this keeps you going. But many times, in the heat of battle, if I can call it that, it is a great desire to do the job you've been sent to do."
Malan took charge of his men during this year and carved them into killing machines. Practice, practice was his motto. Hard on his men and even harder on himself, he would not stand for failure. He needed to make sure that as many of his airmen as possible survived to fly and fight another day, and he formulated an aggressive fighting spirit to give them the best possible odds.
That word was often used because of his approach to them and the way he treated them and the way he respected them, and because that respect was returned. He was strict, but very fair, and he expected everyone to give 100%, but people willingly did that. Certainly never had the chance to talk to Sailor, but I saw written down Malan saying the job of killing the Hun is a serious business. When you go up, make your target 4 enemy planes every sortie. You won't do it, of course, but it's no use going for just the one and then coming home. A sailor's aggressive spirit.
Malan would hone his flying skills and admonish his men to get in close. He resighted the guns on his Spitfire to converge at a closer range. This meant you would have to be at a closer firing distance to the enemy to make sure you hit him. His gunsight camera would capture many of his kills, and the footage would be used in Allied propaganda and training films. The footage exists to this day, and it shows just how close Malan sometimes got to his target.
I think it was an article in 1940 in the Daily Telegraph. He himself is quoted as saying, "This is the first quality of a successful fighter pilot, his flying characteristics and the way he expresses himself. He must think in terms of offense rather than defense. He must at all times be the attacker. Both his mind and body must be alert, and both must react instinctively to any tactical situation. When you are flying, you have no time to think."
In a combat report later in 1940, Malan clinically describes the intensity of these air-to-air engagements to the point where he blacked out. Took off at 15:10 hours to intercept fighter raids approaching London. I climbed mostly on an upsun course to 26,000 feet and flew towards the anti-aircraft bursts over the Thames estuary. At approximately 15:30 hours, we suddenly saw 2 yellow noses, Me-109s, and surprised them from the sun. I gave the right-hand one a 2-second burst with quarter deflection from 200 yards and closed to 150 yards astern, and delivered another 2-second burst. I then closed to 100 yards and delivered a 4-second burst, which appeared to damage the elevator controls, as his nose went vertically downwards very suddenly instead of the usual half roll. My engine naturally stopped when I followed suit, but it picked up again and I closed to 150 yards on a half roll and gave another 4-second burst. I found myself doing an aileron turn to keep direction and delivered another 4-second burst. He then started to smoke, but I blacked out completely and lost consciousness for a couple of seconds, and eventually pulled out at 9,000 feet above cloud. My port guns failed to fire during the whole engagement. Like the accounts in Malan's detailed combat reports, John Freeborn described his feelings and experiences of air combat, as well as the sense of remorse he felt with the passing of time after the war.
But many times you shoot at an aircraft, use all your ammunition on it, see things flying from it, but it goes on sailing happily back towards northern France. But of course, you don't know what damage you've done to it, and if it lands even safely, if the crew were alive, no idea, which to me now, in my older years, I feel very sad about. But there's no great exhilaration about shooting an airplane down. It is a job of work. The heat of battle is a job that has to be done to the best of your ability, with the help of your colleagues, never ever forgetting that they help you to do the job that you've been trained to do. So I don't get this business of the heat of the battle. I don't get this feeling of flying against the enemy, dogfighting, etc., etc. These attitudes are for the magazines. They don't apply to Spitfire pilots.
It was during the Battle of Britain that Malan would endear himself to the British. Like so many of the few, he would cut loose, or in his words, cut some cake, in the skies above London and the English Channel, face inconceivable odds and return each day to take the battle to the enemy. By this time, he had become acting flight lieutenant and had been awarded a Distinguished Flying Cross by the King for his action over Dunkirk.
Cuthbert Ord, the artist who painted and drew sketches of so many fighter pilots during the Battle of Britain, he produced some great sketches of him. He said, "I've seldom been more impressed by anyone as I was for the first time I saw Sailor Malan. A very quiet manner and an air of authority made it obvious that here was a leader of great determination and ability. He would undoubtedly improve a squadron, however good, not by sword waving, but by strength of mind and integrity."
He was very, very good at his job. He was generally regarded as an excellent leader. He wasn't a chest-thumping, speech-giving, self-grandizing kind of leader. He lived to a standard, and he expected other people to do the same. And he cared very much for his pilots. And those who flew with him, they spoke of him with great affection and admiration. And they respected the fact that he was soft-spoken, that he led from the front, that he protected his junior pilots. He never asked someone to do something he wouldn't do himself. He was fair. He didn't play favorites. He treated the ground crew with great respect. He saw everybody working at the airfield as being part of the war effort. And that really created a great deal of respect and support for him.
The battle would rage during the English summer. Malan would fly 4 or 5 sorties a day against waves of Luftwaffe bombers and fighters, crossing the Channel to bomb England into submission and soften it up for Germany's Operation Sea Lion invasion. Cities burned, and all that stood between victory and defeat were a group of boys, the few, the men of the RAF's Fighter Command. Daily, Hurricanes and Spitfires would head into the contrails left by the enemy in the blue skies over England. Many would never return. Malan would command some of these men. The responsibility and extreme stress of leadership, of trying to prepare these untested pilots, weighed on him, and certainly had both emotional and mental effects both during the war and after the war, until his death. The term PTSD was not a term in use at that time, and certainly men of Malan's generation were not given to openly expressing their fear and emotions. The impact of these physical and psychological stresses would become more and more apparent, as we will see later in his life. Driven to give these men the best fighting chance to survive, he was determined to and helped evolve RAF tactics.
He was constantly looking at ways of improving the way the squadron could fly and fight, both formation-wise and the setting up of the cannon and so forth, to get the optimum setting for the cannon fire, to concentrate the cannon on enemy aircraft, all that sort of thing. He never stopped doing that, I don't think, but mainly in tactics, which he was always trying to refine. You must always go up thinking you're going to score, and again, and possibly again, and possibly again, don't give up. Very evident that Taylor regarded it as his squadron. He was going to make his squadron the best. I think that's very, very much the case.
One of the main attributes of Sailor Malan was the care he took to ensure that he could make combat as safe as possible, which is almost a contradiction in terms. He achieved this by employing tactics which he himself evolved.
He did take less experienced pilots up, and by the tactics that he did evolve, he was able to ensure that an eye could be kept, if you like, some sort of protection could be afforded these newer pilots whilst they gained experience and became more experienced in air-to-air fighting and so forth. And those tactics are something which Sailor was always looking at, trying to find better ways of doing that. That was part of Sailor's ethos, after all, was to preserve his squadron, preserve the guys on the squadron as best he was able to, given the various dangerous things they were doing. He was trying to make it as safe for them as it was possible to do.
According to some accounts, he steadfastly and stubbornly challenged RAF command when it came to tactics. He would give everything in the fight to stop London becoming an inferno. Sometimes he would shoot down a German bomber or fighter, and it would plunge into the English soil, Other times he would land and have to watch as the bombers wreaked havoc. His score would rise steadily over time, and he would shoot down one of Germany's great aces, Werner Molders, damaging his plane even though he lived to fight another day. This encounter was immortalized in a painting by Tiro Forster. According to the background story, the painting was commissioned by another ace, Johnny Johnson. What we believe to be his combat report of the Molders encounter reads as follows. I was leader on interception patrol on reported enemy raid on Dover. Climbed to 18,000 feet, having been ordered to engage enemy fighters and leave bombers to hurricanes. Met up with 6 or 9 Me-109 at 18,000 feet, coming from the sun towards Dover to attack some hurricanes. Turned on their tails without being observed and led Red Section into attack. Gave one enemy aircraft about 5 2-second bursts from 250 yards, closing in to 100 yards. He attended no evasion tactics, except gentle right-hand turn and decreasing speed, by which I concluded he had at least had his controls hit. Shot away. I then turned on another Me-109, which had turned past my nose and delivered 3 deflection bursts at 100 yards range. He went down in a spiral. I then returned as my munition had run out. During one bombing raid in particular, the war got very personal for Malan. His son, Jonathan, had just been born outside of London. Linda and Jonathan were at a nursing home awaiting their return home when a German night bombing raid came over. Without thinking twice, Malan called his ground crew and demanded that they ready his Spitfire for action. The raid came over his airfield and the bombers then continued on their bombing run. This did not stop Malan. He got into his Spitfire, powered up its monstrous Merlin engine, and headed off in pursuit. Within minutes, Malan shot down 2 bombers. He had used the searchlights from anti-aircraft batteries to help highlight the enemy. Again, his combat report recalls this incredible night. During an air raid in the locality of Southend, various enemy aircraft were observed and held by searchlights for prolonged periods. On request from squadron, I was allowed to take off with 1 Spitfire. I climbed towards enemy aircraft, which was making for the coast, and held in searchlight beams at 8,000 feet. I positioned myself astern and opened fire at 200 yards and close to 50 yards with 1 burst. Observed bullets entering enemy aircraft and had my windscreen covered in oil. Broke off to the left and immediately below as enemy aircraft spiraled out of beam. Climbed to 12,000 feet towards another enemy aircraft held by searchlights in northerly course. Opened fire at 250 yards, taking good care not to overshoot this time. Gave 5 2-second bursts and observed bullets entering all over enemy aircraft with slight deflection as he was turning to port. Enemy aircraft emitted heavy smoke and I observed 1 parachute open very close. Enemy aircraft went down in spiral dive. I followed him right down until he crashed in flames over Chelmsford. Jonathan Malan recalls hearing of his father's exploits that night.
I'm told that when my mother was in a nursing home about to give birth to me, it was at a place outside London for safety reasons. It was a nursing home near the Thames River, and my dad started to get jittery, and I'm told that he went up at night when there was a bombing raid and shot 2 aircraft down. So the night that I was born, I'm told that my dad shot 2 planes out of the sky over London.
During this sortie, Malan became the first pilot to shoot down 2 enemy bombers at night and was awarded a bar to his DFC, yet another accolade. This would have been enough were it not for something that happened a few months later, also concerning Malan's son. Later in the war, with all that he had been going through, he remarked that one of the scariest things he had done was to ask Winston Churchill to be his son's godfather. Churchill readily agreed, and with that statement we perhaps get an inkling of sailors' humorous side. Churchill had introduced us to the few in one of his greatest ever speeches, when he commented on the Battle of Britain. As a visitor to the many fighter command airfields that lay scattered over England during the war, he knew more than most the sacrifices airmen were making. In August 1940, at the height of the Battle of Britain, Malan was promoted to commander of 74 Squadron.
74 Squadron was very successful during the Battle of Britain. I think Sailor became commander of the squadron on the 8th of August 1940. Within 3 days of that, at the height of the Battle of Britain, the squadron was launched 4 times during the day on the 11th of August. And it became known as Sailors' Day because during the course of those 4 launches, 74 Squadron destroyed 23 enemy aircraft, 1 probable with 14 damaged, all within the course of 1 day on the 11th of August 1940. So that really set the tone of sailors' command of the squadron. They had success before that, but not on that scale. I mean, that was a tremendous effort. Certainly a day like the 11th of August, they realized that really they had cemented their place in history with that sort of success.
His coolness under fire showed when he saw one of his pilots get shot up by a German fighter. He shouted for him not to bail out and pulled in close to escort the stricken plane back to the airfield. His temper also showed when armorers were not quick enough in getting the planes ready again for combat. He angrily admonished them, as the squadron was on constant alert and planes needed to be able to take off to intercept bombing raids at a moment's notice. Regardless, the ground crew's respect for him was firm, as Bob Cossey found during his research of personnel who had served with 74 Squadron, and those who had had first-hand experiences with Malan.
One of the ground crew I taught was a guy named Bill Felstead. He long departed, I'm afraid, but he said to me, those were the days. Churchill was so right. What marvellous men they were. Malan was the most wonderful man I ever met. Certainly in all my long service in the RAF, I never met another like him. And that was repeated several times with other ground crew I met. It's almost hero worship, isn't it?
The airfields were being bombed constantly by the Germans, and RAF Fighter Command was taking a pounding. Young new pilots were continuously being trained, and many would be sent up with minimal time spent in a Spitfire. Malan would once comment that he could see when a pilot was not going to come back.
Sailor is often mischaracterized by the media and historians alike as aloof and cold-blooded. In fact, he was soft-spoken and reserved, although he had little patience for hogwash and injustice. As one newspaper article, written after the war, noted, he is a fellow who hates noise and fuss, hugs his privacy, and never really thaws out in a crowd. Although those who flew with him described him as reserved and almost impossible to know, those he warmed up to found a fiercely loyal friend in him. One of the officers who flew with him at 74 Squadron wrote, I found the most endearing thing about him was that apart from being an exceptional shot, he was just an ordinary chap.
Perhaps it was his reserved outward nature that helped him rationalize everything he had been able to do, to be able to fly endless sorties without appearing to be concerned about the threat to his own mortality, which was always one burst of well-directed Messerschmitt gunfire away. Retired South African Air Force radar operator Christo du Toit, now chairman of the South African Air Force Association's branch in Kimberley, recalls coming across a quote attributed to Malan as told by reporter Quinton Reynolds in the book Glorious Summer.
He asked Malan if he would like to borrow some books. No, replied Malan. I've never read a book in my life for pleasure. To enjoy reading, it seems to me a man requires a lot of imagination. And then he replied, I have no imagination at all. Maybe that's why I'm still alive. When you're up there fighting, you've got to be realistic. And when you come back, you've got to put it all out of your mind. A lot of youngsters go to bed at night and then fight the scrambles. Thank God I'm not the worrying kind. They are the first to go.
Jonathan was told about his father's ability to compartmentalize his work and role as a leader from all other aspects of his life.
I'm told that during the war he was very sociable, except when he was in command. He stepped into another persona when he was in command. He really had a job to do, he had a responsibility. He would not take any nonsense. He was a very honest man. And he became what many people in wartime situations had to become. Very strong for the sake of others. Very ruthless. They all knew, and they backed him up on that. They were happy to follow him as their leader. He taught them to become cold, calculated killing machines.
Malan had led since May 1940, and the strain was showing. Time and again, he would chase planes around the sky, scoring kills, running out of ammunition, getting tagged by bullets from enemy 109s. But he would always land and then return back into the fray. On the rare times his squadron wasn't in action, Malan was frustrated and anxious to get back into the fight. But everyone is human, especially facing the relentless pressure and intensity of warfare. In one account, we get a glimpse of Malan allowing his emotions to get the better of him. He had returned from a sortie and sat alone in one of the barracks. Tears streamed down his face as everything caught up with him. The terror of trying to kill another man who is trying to kill you. The weight of command. The solitary hours of boredom waiting for the enemy. The seconds of extreme fear when they arrived and a dogfight ensued. The comrades that never returned to fight another day. Crispin Trace met Malan a few years after the war, and they became close friends.
We never talked about the war at all. But looking back afterwards and knowing what it must have been like for a sailor to have had to accept these young, inexperienced pilots and put them in a plane and send them up to aerial battle. It must have been very hard for him. It made me realize that he must have been like that during the war. He was in charge of Squadron 74, which was one of the busiest squadrons that there was. He, I think, was cut up and got his syndrome from knowing that the young pilots that were replacing the old ones were going to last about a week to 2 weeks. That's all. It wasn't in his nature to do that. He would have liked to have trained them up somehow, taught them how to stay alive. And he wasn't able to do that because they were flying 5 or 6 sorties a day at the time, and they had to get every airplane in the sky. That made me realize, that he really was a kind-hearted chap. He certainly didn't like his pilots getting killed. He was in a situation which didn't call for any kind-heartedness. It caused for attack, which he did damned well. But I'm sure that that's what got at him.
This unerring duty of care for his men is a trait that stood out as Malan continued his path through the ranks, each of which brought different responsibilities.
And when I investigated leadership in the RAF in the Second World War, there was no training for it.
Historian Dr. Helen Doe.
Whereas today you go to all sorts of management schools and everything else. Then there was no direct training. It was you learnt on the job. Or you learnt by the mistakes previous commanding officers made. And that to me is the thing that comes through about Malan, that he understood management, he understood leadership, and he understood how to drive and get the best out of his men. And he was much loved for that.
Part of the job of managing, of course, is managing upwards, not just managing down. Getting what you think is best, and when you're on the front line, doing everything you can to maximize the chance of bringing your men back, such as challenging outdated tactics.
They'd taken all the First World War stuff. They'd been doing all these wonderful big formation flying over London to defend London pre-war, very fixed formation. When it actually came to combat in the air, they rapidly realized you're going to get killed doing that. So if Malan's fighting on behalf of his men and he's developing his tactics, not in isolation, by the way, because they are learning from other people. They're talking to one another. The squadrons, Hornchurch, you've got 4 squadrons in one place. So the commanding officers are certainly talking to one another, and they're learning from this. They're learning these examples. And if you need to change things, you've got to fight the hierarchy. My father used to call the call the officers who didn't fly as penguins, because they flapped a lot but didn't fly. They tended to stick to rules rather than realizing that the fighter pilots who'd engaged knew what they were talking about.
Management is really what it came down to, and Malan proved himself to be a natural manager. He had a style about him with his background in the Merchant Navy and what he'd learned and developed through active combat. It all came together to help him manage everyone he came into contact with, the senior leadership as well as the new recruits.
In air warfare and in warfare generally, you always have those, the specialist few like Malan, Tuck and others who were the hunter-killers who could go out there and down several enemy planes. But the percentage of people who could do that was actually really tiny, because there were plenty of fighters on both sides who didn't actually shoot anything down. I mean, let's not assume that every single fighter pilot that went up, shot something down. They didn't. But what you have in the sky is you have the hunter-killers on both sides who are really good at shooting others down, and the rest are targets. So what he's doing here is he's trying to stop some of his men from being pure targets and giving them advice on that as well.
Malan once likened air combat to entering a dark room with a madman waving a knife about. Coping with that fear wasn't something that came natural to anyone. The fighting man he had become, however, simply took over and took control. It used his strengths and buried his weaknesses, an approach that he instilled in those who flew with him. Malan's individual combats during the Battle of Britain are too numerous to mention, and by the time it ended, he had more than played his part. He achieved recognition in the UK for his achievements, and as a key participant, he would lead Battle of Britain anniversaries and commemorations at Biggin Hill and elsewhere in the following years. Surprisingly, as John Freeborn remarked, Malan didn't have a strong South African accent. His many years at sea, away from the country at such an early age, had taken it away from him, as we hear in a news clip from a Biggin Hill commemoration where Malan dedicated a memorial.
The unveiling of the memorial was carried out by that famous ace, Group Captain Malan.
In thankful remembrance of the pilots of this sector from Great Britain, the British Dominions and Allied nations, who by their sacrifice helped to win a great victory, I unveil this memorial in their honor and to the glory of God.
And here are recorded the names of some of the few who saved Britain and the Allied cause in 1940.
Fighter and Bomber Command went on the offensive and took the air war to occupied Europe, probing and attacking with formations of hundreds of planes. Malan would fly protection for these and chase down enemy fighters that threatened them. By 1941, Malan had become a squadron leader and then a wing commander, and had added to his medal roll. He had shot down numerous enemy aircraft and inflicted damage on many others. He had been on active service and in command as a leader for nearly 13 months and had taken part in many of the offensive combat missions over Hitler's Europe since the end of the Battle of Britain. He was also a household name and had reluctantly given many interviews and broadcasts, but he was physically and mentally exhausted. Malan had tried to shun the limelight, but a thankful country hadn't allowed him. Neither had his superiors, insisting on wartime tours and news clips to aid the battle to win hearts and minds. He had even recorded messages and met the press from his own country. The press in South Africa, however, was unsurprisingly divided when it came to covering Malan. Depending where on the political spectrum the newspaper fell, he would either be praised, ignored, or vilified.
The Afrikaans press were obviously fairly negative. In contrast, the English language press in South Africa, they towed the party line. They supported the Allied cause very openly. Publications like the Cape Times, the Argus. So they had very different takes on it. But even so, Sailor was more celebrated in the British press because he flew for the RAF.
Sailor would later face relentless attacks from the South African government, ridiculed as a flying poodle and labelled as a traitor to his people. quite unlike the very clear perception back in Britain, where one London journalist referred to him as the South African Springbok who had become a British lion. But it was never adulation that he sought.
My father always felt uncomfortable as a hero because he was gentle, friendly man. He was a quiet man, and he was embarrassed by the attention.
In late 1941, it was decided that Malan should take a break and go on a publicity and educational tour of the USA. America had not entered the war, and the RAF had a lot of combat experience to share. Sir Harry Broadhurst, who would become Air Chief Marshal, accompanied Malan and others, including Stanford Tuck, on the tour. His private film collection includes footage of the months-long tour, a rare glimpse of the pilots, relaxed, in lighter moments, but also meeting fellow USA pilots and flying with them. He said that Malan's fellow travelers got much pleasure out of introducing him to the Americans by his first name, Adolf. Malan never used Adolf, instead he was referred to as John, and this is how he introduced himself to Linda when they first met. He did the usual public talks, but not much flying. This frustrated him, and finally, on a tour to a US base, he insisted that he went up. Historian Dr. Helen Doe picks up the story.
Both Tuck and Malan by now are both wing commanders, so they've been leading wings, both out of Biggin Hill at various times. Malan takes a group of pilots, Tuck takes a group of pilots, and they show them what it's like in the air, because the US pilots are desperate to get their first-hand experience and knowledge of what it's really like happening now in the skies over Europe. And so these two men, who are so highly regarded as being absolutely top of their game, are there to show the sorts of very real tactics that will keep them alive and winning when and if, at that stage, the US actually enters the war.
On one occasion, the US commander mentioned that at that very time, there were 12 US planes in the air on a training mission. Malan got into a P-39, took off, and proceeded to shoot down all 12 in under 10 minutes. The gun camera footage from the plane provided the proof of this incredible feat, and proof for Malan that his concern that the Americans were not ready for air combat was well-founded. He had experienced firsthand that they still used outdated tactics. They would need to learn quickly. This became more evident once Pearl Harbor had been attacked soon after. A virtually unknown part of his story is the deep respect and admiration many in America had for Malan, not only because of his fighting prowess, ability, and character, but also because of his stance after the war. Years later, when the South African government refused to give Malan a military funeral and banned all public service, including military members, from attending, the United States sent a representative to honor Malan's contributions.
The US Air Force military attaché was Flight Lieutenant Thurman. I'm not sure whether he actually met Sailor during the war when he was in the US. He goes to the ambassador and he says, we need to honor this man. So the US sent this military attaché to attend the funeral in full uniform with a colleague.
After 4 years with 74 Squadron, Malan had left to become wing commander at Biggin Hill Fighter Station. It was a very sad farewell. He had been through so much with his beloved Tigers of 74.
And when he was rested, at the time he was the wing commander at Biggin Hill, his score was 27 enemy aircraft destroyed, 7 shared, 2 unconfirmed, 3 probables, and 16 damaged. At the time, he was the Royal Air Force's leading fighter ace.
Biggin Hill is one of the most famous locations of the war. It was from here that hundreds of planes were commanded and flew into combat. While at Biggin Hill, Malan would spend many happy evenings at the nearby White Hart Inn. A favorite of many pilots at the time, his signature would be inscribed, along with others, on blackout boards used to cover windows during bombing raids. His command, however, didn't stop him from joining the missions into Europe. He would join up with wings from other airfields and head into battle. When the German fighters didn't come up to fight, he would supposedly taunt them by producing contrails in the sky with his Spitfire, as if to say, "Here we are. What are you waiting for?" He also had a free Polish squadron under his command, and apparently when one of its pilots was shot down and taken prisoner, he received a letter from the pilot warning him that the Germans were keen to get their hands on the famous sailor. This being said, we came across a German article on Malan of unknown origin, written following his death. It captures his character in a simple phrase: the fighting gentleman. Ironic, considering who it came from. But Malan's willingness to still lead his men in combat irked the high command. They did not want to lose him. So, in March 1942, he was moved to the Central Gunnery School, where he formed a fighter wing to train pilots in the deadly art of air combat. For Malan, this began with the attitude and mindset a fighter pilot must have in the cockpit. He has to be cold. He must have an aggressive nature. He must at all times be an attacker. He fights with his head, not his heart. It is against the nature of a Spitfire to run away.
It was obviously primarily in terms of aggression, and that was why he's saying, don't be defensive, be aggressive all the time. But also imbued in some of the rules that he formulated were aimed at protecting the squadron itself as far as possible when it was dogfighting, which was a terribly, terribly dangerous business.
Malan would describe his own experiences and make them part of the lessons he would use for training his young airmen. It was at this time that he created his famous 10 rules for air fighting, a mantra that would be stuck up on the walls of fighter bases around England. Dr. Helen Doe takes us through each one.
Malan's 10 rules for air fighting are famous, really famous. I think they're famous because they're clear, they're short, and there's just 10 of them. Because in the First World War, there were also air fighting rules developed by the aces then. And some of them were quite long and quite complicated. So Malan comes along, and essentially it's just giving the fighter pilot something simple and straightforward to focus on. And really basic, he's being absolutely direct. Number 1, wait until you see the whites of his eyes. Fire short bursts of 1 to 2 seconds, and only when your sights are definitely on. Some pilots had a tendency, through nerves or anxiety and stress, to start firing as soon as they saw the enemy, which wasted ammunition and time. So what he's saying is get in as close as you can and just, hold back until you can get in as close as you can. Number 2, whilst shooting, think of nothing else. Brace the whole of the body, have both hands on the stick, concentrate on your ring sight. It's about how you are in that aircraft. So your brain, just think of nothing else. And then physically brace the whole of the body. So it's your body that is part of this shooting. Have both hands on the stick, concentrate on your ring sight. So you're not just pressing a button, your mind and body are there as well. I mean, this is Olympic training, really, isn't it? Number 3, always keep a sharp lookout. Keep your finger out. When you're in the sky, you've got this multi-dimensional game going on, dangerous and deadly game. You don't know what's going to happen or where it's going to come from. 1 minute you're in empty sky, next minute you're surrounded by planes with crosses on, as my father put it. So you've got to keep a very sharp lookout, but also not for just yourself, but very often what they began to develop was flying in pairs. So you would have a wingman and they would look out for you and you'd look out for them. 4, height gives you the initiative. When they were given their vector, very often, to begin with, the pilots would go up to the level at which the enemy was going to be. The enemy could then see them coming. What they needed to do was get above the enemy and come down, and especially come down and out of the sun. So, as he puts it, height gives you the initiative, and that's really crucial. That's why sometimes the big wing initiative, the idea of getting everybody together, was so criticised, because you couldn't be as flexible as Malan is suggesting. 5, always turn and face the attack. So in other words, just make sure that when you are attacked, swing fast. That's the joy of Spitfires. Hurricanes, not so much, but a Spitfire, what a joy. You could just whiz it round. It just makes sense, but you just need to underline it. 6, make your decisions promptly. It is better to act quickly, even though your tactics are not the best. So he's not saying this is about the fine art. This is about achieving something. Your tactics may not be the best, but make a quick decision. 7, never fly straight and level for more than 30 seconds in the combat area. You risk being a target. 8, when diving to attack, always leave a proportion of your formation above to act as top guard. So just make sure you've always got that extra bit of protection if you can. Couldn't always happen, because sometimes they split up and they didn't know where everybody was. But just try and do that. 9, initiative, aggression, air discipline, and teamwork are the words that mean something in air fighting. It's not about blind flying to rules or this formation of flying they'd all been trained on, or the pre-war pilots. It's thinking, aggression, air discipline. And part of air discipline was radio discipline. Really, really important. And that was something that so many of the leaders had to keep banging on about. Radio discipline, make sure you're clear on that. And teamwork. You're part of a team. There were a lot of individualists who would go off and just decide to pick off somebody here and there, but if you worked as a team, you're far better. And these are the words that mean something in air fighting. So he summarizes all of this in number 10, and this isn't an extra rule, this is simply his summary. Go in quickly, punch hard, and then the crucial bit, get out. These are powerful rules that anyone today can read and understand. And that's what it was about. So no wonder they were so taken up and used in so many places, and deservedly famous. But it says so much about the man and his style of management.
These rules belie much of Malan's character, ever focused on the job in hand, to defeat the enemy, but underpinned by the desire to bring as many of his boys safely home again. Coming up on episode 4 of Face the Attack, the 3 battles of Sailor Malan. Wartime life brings challenges for the Malan family, as Sailor is a hero to many, but just dad to his son.
I remember sitting on his lap, I remember playing games with him, but I don't remember him being at home as often as he would probably like to be.
A friend of Sailor and fellow South Africans recollect their own and their country's involvement in the war.
I just looked up and it's the first time I'd seen the swastika in my life. I saw it on the tail of this fucking wolf.
The family returns to South Africa, and one battleground is switched for another as the National Party wins the 1948 election and institutes new laws that change the face of a nation.
The National Party begins using this word that slides into its circles, and this word is called apartheid.
Malan is drawn into politics for the first time, only to reject it with distaste, trying to replace it with the family life he never had.
My father made his choice. I'm going father. Cheers.
And the government pushes even further.
To this day, I have come across people who refer to the removal of the coloured franchise as the Great Betrayal.
Face the Attack, the 3 battles of Sailor Malan was written and produced by Protea Rose Originals. To receive weekly episodes, plus additional content, follow this series wherever you find your favorite podcasts. To discover more, visit facetheattack.com.